Avoiding legal conflict in setting up a company in Vietnam. Part of the series Global Business Law in 20 Minutes with Federico Vasoli. This is our topic for today.
Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent.
Hello and welcome. My name is Natalia Łowska-Czajka. I am a lawyer, advocate, and mediator from Warsaw, Poland.
Hi, everyone. This is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout Florida and Texas.
And hi, everyone. I'm Federico Vasoli, Italian lawyer, managing partner of the MTV Global with offices in Malta, Singapore, and Vietnam.
And it's great to be back with our interesting topics on Vietnam this time. Last time in the last episodes, we've been discussing the situation in Vietnam and more likely Vietnam being one of the top destinations in Asia to invest. Federico, who is practicing also in this area and helping clients there, will now be revealing to us what it means to set up a company in Vietnam or similar entity that would have the possibility to act within the trade limits there. However, avoiding potential conflicts. Federico, good to have you again. Please tell us, setting up a company in Vietnam, is it something difficult? Is it something bringing a conflict from the very first view?
Thank you, Natalia. It's great to be back. And yes, let's link up to the last episode where we discussed how Vietnam's outlook could be in 2022. If things go well, especially with the pandemic, Vietnam is poised to be a top destination for investors from all over the world. As an alternative, not necessarily a substitute, mind you, but as an additional place for investments on top of China. In particular, if logistics, freight forwarding, and raw materials prices remain sticky, as economists say. So if prices are still so expensive, then it makes sense, unless you manufacture something which is really local, to consider perhaps setting up a smaller factory in an area of the world that grows so much with so many potential consumers like Southeast Asia, that with the recent free trade agreement signed with Europe, with the European Union, with the UK, the RCEP that includes China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and many others, is the largest free trade area in the world. So set up a company there and you may have access to massive number of consumers. Having said this as an introduction, yes, two things. There are various forms for investments in Vietnam, and two, yes, there could be, say, conflicts, difficulties since the very beginning. So let's start with the forms very briefly. I would essentially say that there are four ways to set foot in Vietnam as a foreigner. Limited liability companies, joint stock companies, branch offices, and representative offices. Now, I'm a big fan of representative offices, and maybe we can talk about it later. I'm not a big fan of branch offices. And between the two main types of companies, limited liability companies are perhaps the easiest form for investments. Also, limited liability companies are the only form of company between the two that allows for uni-nominal shareholders, meaning you are one shareholder, one company, one natural person, you want to invest in Vietnam without any other shareholder, you can use an LLC. If you want to use the form of a joint stock company, you must have at least 3 shareholders, regardless of whether they are natural persons or legal entities. As for difficulties that could arise since the very beginning, I would say, first of all, language. I mean, everything has to be conducted in Vietnamese. Sure, you can talk to your shareholders, your partners, your suppliers, your clients, your lawyers, your accountants, your whatever, in English or any other language that is familiar to you. But the official documents must be translated officially into Vietnamese. And the level of bureaucracy is indeed quite high. all across Asia. Is not just Vietnam, with the notable exception of Singapore and possibly Hong Kong, that I'm not so familiar with anymore. I work much more in Singapore. Actually, our headquarters are in Singapore. Singapore is the quintessence of efficiency, of a pro-business environment, etc. But Vietnam and many other Asian nations, China, etc., I think also Japan, tend to be highly bureaucratic. So you need to have most documents notarized by a public notary in your home country, then translated into Vietnamese, legalized by a consular office of diplomatic representation there. So yes, since the very beginning, there could be some booby traps, some tricky aspects to consider.
So, Federico, are there any kind of businesses you don't see, or is it just a free for all? If the economy is, starting to grow and it's one of the fastest in the world, what kind of entities do you typically see when it comes to business types?
Typically, it's limited liability companies and representative offices. Why? Because joint stock companies are reserved either for certain regulated industries, banks, insurance companies, etc. And indeed, there are banks, insurance companies, and companies that are regulated from abroad that set up in Vietnam, and they must be incorporated as joint stock companies. Joint stock companies also are easier to manage when it comes to selling or buying bonds and stocks. That is their purpose, essentially. But most small and medium enterprises, even big ones, to be honest, are set up as limited liability companies. And then representative offices, this is quite peculiar, and I'm quite curious to ask you both whether in Texas, Florida, Poland, you have something similar. That is, in countries like Malta and Italy, where I'm originally from, we don't really have a precise definition of representative office. That is, you do have a definition of permanent establishment. So if a company actively conducts business in a country without being incorporated as such, you have, I don't know, a Polish company that comes to, let's say, Italy and conducts business there without registering, it could likely be considered to be a permanent establishment and therefore be forced, of course, to pay taxes in Italy and follow other regulations. But in Vietnam, following probably the Chinese example, don't forget that China opened up to free trade in 1979 and the following years with the Deng Xiaoping reforms. And Vietnam started off a few years later with the so-called Doi Moi in Vietnamese in 1986. In Vietnam, as I was saying, there is a law that specifies what a representative office is, how to incorporate it, how to manage it, how to close it. It's a very flexible instrument. It doesn't require any capitalization by definition because it is just an office that represents another legal entity from abroad. And it must have a chief representative in the place where it is established. And that's it. So as long as you have an office, not a virtual one, a real office, a chief representative that must be a resident in Vietnam. So it could be anyone, it could be a foreigner, but that person needs to legally reside in Vietnam. And you fill in some papers and file an application, which is relatively easy to do. You have a representative office. Mind you, this could be quite tricky. You can open as many representative offices as you want in Vietnam, but the same person cannot hold the role of chief representative of more than one office. So if any of you is thinking about moving to Vietnam and setting up two representative offices, there are two main cities in Vietnam. There's the capital, Hanoi, which, not so surprisingly, is the city that is attracting the largest number of investments, especially from other Asian countries like South Korea, Japan, but also America and Europe. And Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, which is still the business capital of Vietnam. It's where small and medium companies go. Now, if you want to open two representative offices, one in Hanoi, one in Saigon, typical choice. You must have two different people that represent each office. You cannot have one. This is one of the complications, the little tricks that occur in doing business in Vietnam.
Yeah, and it is complicated because you asked the question, well, how does it compare to my jurisdiction or Natalia's jurisdiction? So I would not have enough knowledge in international business law and connecting it with employment immigration law to be able to give a correct answer. But suffice to say, if somebody was looking into starting a business in your jurisdiction in Vietnam, they might need legal counsel, right? So, and that's why you're talking about this. So, just wanted to follow up with one more thing. So, one of the reasons I asked the question earlier, what kind of entities you see, was also for you to just give us a little bit of an example of, uh, do you mean these are going to be kind of shoe stores, um, service organizations, or is there a certain type of business that you generally see the same type being repeated over and over and over again? I'm just trying to ask a layman's question. Like, what kind of businesses do you typically see people are starting up and investing in Vietnam when they're a foreigner?
Typically, it's manufacturing. Vietnam being a strong manufacturing hub, and not just for cheap or low quality goods. Suffice to say that Samsung, the Korean giant, is the largest employer in Vietnam, and that Apple in 2020, I think, through Foxconn, which I think is Taiwanese but operates in China, in Shenzhen, started testing the manufacturing of high-end Apple products like MacBooks, I think iPads and others, the AirPods and others in Vietnam. So it is not necessarily a low-end manufacturing country. It's also a tech hub more and more. Its population is very young. The average age is, I think, 32 years old. Almost 100 million people. So these young people are versed naturally in new technologies, new trends, and that is good news for the country. The other thing that I see is, of course, the sale of foreign goods. So that doesn't necessarily entail setting up a legal entity in Vietnam. It could be simple enough, it could be good enough to set up a representative office that, mind you, cannot invoice in Vietnam. A representative office doesn't necessarily even have a bank account in Vietnam because it represents another legal entity. But it is useful to be there, to be in the market, to be known, to learn, to listen to local consumers, partners, etc. So the other trend that I see is anything that comes from abroad that might be appealing in a market that has the characteristics that I have just mentioned. So fashion, luxury, kitchenware, consumer goods, all of that. So it's both things. It's both taking advantage of what Vietnam has to offer in terms of supply to be sold, not necessarily locally, but all over the area and potentially the world. There are very famous brands of sneakers from America and Europe that are manufactured there in Vietnam, and then they're sold all over the world. And the other way around. There is a need for Western or non-essentially Vietnamese products in the country that could be sold also from abroad, not necessarily using a legal entity there. But a representative office helps because being there, understanding local culture, getting to know potential partners is fundamental, even though, of course, the pandemic took a toll on that.
And when you are describing some difficulties and potential conflicts in setting up a company in Vietnam, you also mentioned the language barrier. I understand that the main language to operate for foreigners there would be English, not Vietnamese. And the necessity of translation is quite easy for me. And in the previous episodes, you also covered these official stamps you need to stamp on all the documents. But I understand that it wouldn't exhaust all the potential issues that would come into play on the way. So what is exactly the language barrier you mentioned?
Absolutely true. Okay, so yes, English is the business language in Vietnam, and it is widespread. Older generations speak European languages because Vietnam was closer to the Soviet Union and to Eastern Europe, to the Eastern European bloc, than it was to China after the Sino-Soviet split. So you might find somebody that speaks Russian, Romanian, Polish, because they were trained there. They studied abroad, and going abroad meant typically going to Russia or any other Eastern European country back in the days. Chinese is, of course, widespread. China is the main trading partner of Vietnam. So And the two languages are monosyllabic and tonal, so the concept is pretty much the same. It's like, I don't know, Portuguese and Romanian, to make a very lame example. And French is almost abandoned, just out of curiosity. So yes, there might be some tricky aspects when it comes to language, because some terms have been translated into English from official sources in a way that could be misleading for native English speakers. Let me rephrase. The legal representative of a company is not called director in Vietnam. In English, in Vietnam, what we call director, a nominee director, an executive director, which is the legal representative of a company, maybe with limited powers if there are other directors that form a board, is not called director in English in Vietnam. It is called legal representative. He or she is called legal representative. What is called, or who is called, director in English in Vietnam is typically the general manager or the CEO. But we know that a manager, the general manager or the CEO, is not necessarily the legal representative of a company. Sometimes he or she is, sometimes he or she is not. And the same applies to other figures. For instance, the member council. The member council is the AGM, is the general meeting of shareholders, but they call it council. Even when it comes to capitalization, the share capital is called charter capital, because it is the charter of the company. And again, the charter is the articles of association of the company, set the share capital, the charter capital. So that could be misleading. But when we were offline, Natalia, I seem to recall that you mentioned that there are some similarities with the English translations of Polish terms. Is that correct?
Well, actually, I would say that there are similar legal tradition of naming things. So a director, which in Polish is a dyrektor, is actually a managing person in the company. And of course, you can have multiple ones, but really back in the communist era, Poland was not a communist country, it was a socialist country rather. But all the entities had directors. And the joke here was that you can be born to be a director. So that will be your long life profession. What's your profession? I'm a director. So, and it doesn't have anything to do with the cinema or with the movie making. A director is the one that manages, that has power, that has money, that is in charge. And I think that I really find similarity between what you're saying and what we happen to have here for years. And I think that that might be a common misunderstanding, because people would really understand that the director is the one that manages and not a manager, who might be actually someone of a lower level. So yes, it can be tricky. You also asked a question about the legal representative and branch offices. And yes, in Poland, it was possible to have both. Actually, the benefit of it is that you still remain, there is a mother company somewhere back there in the original country, and you just come and run the business upon just an umbrella of something that has no legal personality under the particular Polish law in this example. But that then brings certain consequences. And you said that there is like an operation de facto, meaning you set up a company, someone is already operating, and we don't have a recognized concept for that, but tax law and everything will apply immediately, very effectively, bringing the necessary consequences, unpleasant consequences, of course, to anybody who would not follow the proper rule of law in terms of setting up a company, whether in form of a branch or not. And a question to you, Federico, is also, you said that you really don't like branch offices in Vietnam. Why is it so?
Because they bear the same bureaucratic workload that a limited liability company has to bear, but they don't really have the advantages of a limited liability company, for the very simple reason that there is unlimited liability, and then there is much less flexibility on what the branch office can do vis-a-vis what a limited liability company can do. So if you are to go through the same pain, the same bureaucracy, then go full force for a limited liability company and have more flexibility and more power. And worst case, you just close down, you strike off the company, you close it down, you liquidate it, whatever. But the branch office is a bit more complicated to manage. So no, either go full force with a company, could be joint stock company or limited liability company typically, or a representative office, or as many representative offices as you want to set foot, to be physically present in Vietnam, be seen, and learn from the local community.
All right. Well, thank you, Federico. Good insights as always, this time on avoiding conflicts when you're setting up business in Vietnam. So before we take off, Federico, I recall that we had discussed you putting a lot of your videos and podcasts and stuff like that under a specific hashtag, right? So that's searchable. And what was that again?
That was Vietnam Solutions
Exactly.
as well. Yeah.
So hashtag Vietnam Solutions
Yeah.
should then get everybody back to anything and everything that you publish out there on the internet.
Thank you,
So
Mac.
yeah, definitely. And we're definitely going to connect this video to that as well on the channel. All right, everyone. Signing off. This is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney mediator and arbitrator.
Natalia Czajka.
And Federico Vasoli. Bye
All
all.
right, until next time. Take care.